The chair was empty. Just minutes ago, a man had been sitting there. A man who couldn't walk. A man who couldn't stand. A man who couldn't even move without help. But now, on a warm June evening in 1763, in the quiet English countryside, Owen Parfitt had vanished into thin air. And nobody saw a thing. Nobody heard a thing. It was as if he'd simply stopped existing. What happened in those few minutes would become one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in British history. And even after hundreds of years, nobody has ever figured it out. But before we get into today's story, if you enjoy mysteries that'll keep you up at night, strange disappearances that defy explanation, and historical cases that have never been solved, then you're in the right place. Because that's exactly what we cover here. And I upload new stories 3 to 4 times every week. So if that interests you, please gently tap the like button and subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. All right, let's get into today's story, which takes place in Shepton, Mallet, England, in 1763. Owen Parfitt wasn't always the broken man he'd become by the 1760s. Back in his younger days, he'd been a sailor, and not just any sailor. Owen claimed to have lived a life most men could only dream about. He told stories of sailing to the West Indies, India, Africa, and America. He spun tales of piracy on the high seas, of smuggling operations in far-flung ports, and even darker things like black magic and occult practices that would make proper English folk cross themselves. He was a womanizer too, apparently, and there were whispers of a scandal involving his much younger cousin Dorothy that had caused quite a stir in their small community. Whether all these stories were true, or just the embellished memories of an old man trying to make his current circumstances more bearable, nobody could say for certain. But Owen told them with such conviction, such detail, that people couldn't help but listen. By the time Owen reached his 60s, those adventurous days were long behind him. The man who'd once sailed the 7 seas and supposedly cavorted with pirates and practitioners of dark arts was now confined to a simple existence in the rural town of Shepton, Mallet, in Somerset, living with his elderly sister. Some sources say her name was Susanna. Others simply call her Old Susanna. She was about 20 years older than Owen, which would have put her well into her 80s. In that era, both siblings living to such advanced ages was remarkably unusual. Most people didn't make it past 40. What had reduced the once adventurous Owen to his current state was a series of strokes that had gradually paralyzed him almost completely. He was virtually unable to move on his own. He couldn't walk, couldn't stand, couldn't even perform the most basic tasks without assistance. His days now consisted of lying in bed or being carried outside to sit in a chair near the front of his sister's small cottage, which was located near Granfers Barton, just off what was then called the Wells Turnpike. From his chair, Owen would sit in his nightshirt, propped up on his folded greatcoat for support, and pass the time by telling his wild stories to anyone who walked by and would listen. On this particular June evening in 1763, the weather was warm and pleasant. Owen's sister had placed him outside in his usual spot around 7 o'clock in the evening, just as she'd done countless times before. The cottage was surrounded by fields and farmland, and across the road, farm workers were finishing up their daily labor, pooking hay and tending to their final tasks before heading home. These workers were close enough to see the cottage and its front area clearly. Owen sat there quietly in his nightshirt, settled onto his greatcoat, watching the world go by. His sister went back inside the cottage to complete her evening chores. Here's where the details get interesting. Keep that in mind. She was only inside for a short time, probably no more than half an hour at most. The plan was simple. When the evening grew cooler or if weather rolled in, she would come back outside with their neighbor, a younger woman named Susanna Snook, and together the two women would carry Owen back inside and help him into bed. This was their nightly routine. Owen couldn't move himself, so this assistance was absolutely necessary. Around 7 o'clock, storm clouds began gathering on the horizon. Owen's sister and Susanna Snook came outside to retrieve Owen and bring him in before the weather turned. But when they stepped through the door, they stopped dead in their tracks. The chair was there. The greatcoat Owen had been sitting on was there, still folded in the same position. But Owen was gone. Now here's what you need to understand about Owen's condition. He wasn't just a little disabled or slightly impaired. He was almost completely paralyzed. He couldn't stand up without help. He couldn't walk. He couldn't even dress himself. The idea that he somehow got up and walked away on his own was physically impossible. His sister knew this. The neighbor knew this. Everyone in town knew this. So where was he? The two women immediately began searching. They called for him. They looked around the cottage. Nothing. Then they did something that makes this whole thing even stranger. They asked the farm workers who had been laboring in the field directly across from the cottage. These men had been working within clear sight of where Owen had been sitting. They'd been there the entire time Owen's sister had been inside. And here's the thing. Not one of them had seen anything unusual. Not one of them had seen Owen move. Not one of them had seen anyone approach the cottage. Not one of them had heard any sounds of a struggle or commotion. It was as if Owen had simply evaporated. Word spread quickly through the small community. Soon, neighbors, farmhands, and other locals joined the search. They combed the surrounding fields. They searched the woods. They checked wells and ditches. They looked in every conceivable hiding place within walking distance, though of course Owen couldn't have walked there himself. But they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of disturbance, no clues whatsoever. Owen Parfitt had vanished without leaving a single trace. The theories started almost immediately. Owen's sister, deeply religious and superstitious, believed she knew exactly what had happened. Owen had been taken by the devil. His life of wickedness, all those years of piracy and smuggling and womanizing and dabbling in black magic, had finally caught up with him. The devil had come to collect payment for Owen's sins, spiriting him away in an instant as divine punishment. Many of the locals agreed with this explanation. The area around Shepton Mallet had a reputation for witchcraft and supernatural activity, so to them, a supernatural explanation seemed perfectly reasonable. Others had more earthly theories. Some speculated that men from Bristol, perhaps old associates from Owen's shadowy past, had come for him. Maybe they wanted information about treasure Owen had accumulated during his sailing days. Maybe they wanted to force him to reveal hiding places of stolen goods. Or maybe they simply wanted to silence him because he'd been telling too many stories, revealing too many secrets about criminal activities they'd all been involved in decades earlier. But if that were the case, how had they managed to carry a full-grown man away without making any noise, without being seen by the farm workers just across the road, and without leaving any tracks or disturbance? The mystery consumed Shepton Mallet for years. Every so often, someone would claim to have new information or a new theory, but nothing ever led anywhere. The case gradually faded into local legend, becoming one of those strange stories people told to visitors and new residents. The old man who disappeared from his chair. The paralyzed sailor who vanished into thin air. Then, 50 years later, in 1813, something happened that brought the case roaring back to life. A man named Thomas Henry Strode was making alterations to a road at Board Cross, about 120 yards from where Owen's sister's cottage had stood. As workers dug into the ground, they found something. A skeleton. A human skeleton, lying face down in a shallow grave, thrown in hastily as if whoever buried it had been in a hurry or trying to hide their work. The skeleton appeared to have belonged to an older person with physical disabilities. Could this finally be Owen Parfitt? The entire town buzzed with excitement. Finally, after all these years, they might have answers. Medical professionals were brought in to examine the remains, and then came the crushing disappointment. The skeleton wasn't Owen's. It was the body of a young woman. Now there were two mysteries instead of one. Who was this young woman? How did she end up buried in such a crude grave so close to where Owen had disappeared? But those questions would also go unanswered. A year later, in 1814, a lawyer named William Maskell decided to reopen the investigation into Owen's disappearance. He tracked down surviving witnesses and reviewed all the old accounts. But he quickly ran into problems. The witness statements contradicted each other on key details. Some remembered things one way, others remembered them differently. After decades, memories had faded and become unreliable. Maskell was forced to close the case once again without resolution. More than a century after that, in 1933, investigators took another crack at solving the mystery. By then, it had been 170 years since Owen vanished. They used whatever resources and techniques were available at the time, but they fared no better than their predecessors. No new evidence was found. No breakthrough came. The case remained as impenetrable as ever. Owen Parfitt remains one of the most baffling disappearances in British history because of its sheer impossibility. A man who couldn't move disappeared in broad daylight from a spot within clear view of multiple witnesses, none of whom saw or heard anything. No body was ever found. No credible explanation ever emerged. Whether you believe he was taken by forces beyond our understanding, kidnapped by desperate criminals, or met some other fate we can't imagine, the evidence is maddeningly absent. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, I've got another impossible disappearance mystery you need to see. Click the video on your screen right now about the Bennington Triangle cases, where multiple people vanished without a trace in the 1940s. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories like this. Thanks for watching. Until next time, see ya.